Good to be with you again. Our last time together. Today our topic is going to be overcoming sloth through stability and perseverance. Now, sloth is a funny word. Who would ever think that sloth would pertain to the spiritual life? And oftentimes, because of thinking of sloth in terms of how modern people think of sloth, we'll miss what the desert dwellers meant by the term. But what sloth means from a desert dweller's perspective is a lack of care, and particularly a lack of care about one's spiritual life, one's relationship with God. And usually sloth appears when that initial honeymoon period with God slackens. Many of you who are with me today can think back to when you started your relationship with God, and it seemed as though every prayer was answered, God was very near, all was as it should be. And then the Lord, in his wisdom, never being any farther away from you than he ever had been, gets quiet. Or in God's providence, decides now there's a lesson that can be learned. If we struggle with a lack of care, if we struggle with the difficulties inherent in learning to love, we'll be apt to give up. Or think about the word stability. We'll be apt to think, if I could just have a new husband, if I could just have a new community, if I could just join a new church. I know there's a better church out there. These people here drive me crazy. If I could just find a new way to regain that sense of God's nearness to me, if I could just get back to the honeymoon, I know I'd be doing better. And the Lord, in his wisdom and kindness, says, no, I don't think that's the best way to go. Can you think of instances in your life where maybe a situation at work, maybe a situation at church, more particularly for the work that we're doing together, maybe a situation with God, when that initial honeymoon period, which was so lively and near and wonderful, has passed, and you've become discouraged, and the way you've responded to the difficulty of the situation has been a temptation to run or to give up. Rebecca DeYoung, who's a wonderful guide on the spiritual life, talks about sloth involving laziness in learning to love. It's not laziness in a willingness to work. In fact, with this meaning of the word, you might have somebody who's working very hard. They've just given up on God and said to themselves, this is demanding too much of me. Learning to love is too hard. I'm just going to take a break. And then what can happen is that break can last for a long, long time. Think of the effort involved in learning to love another precious image bearer. That effort causes somebody to say, I'm not so sure I want to continue in this relationship. This is too hard. Or I want to make it easier than it's meant to be. Sometimes we can get smacked in the face by occurrences in our lives that don't make sense to us. Why would God allow something like this? And it's surely not a honeymoon period. It's more like a desert. And we're tempted to give up. We're tempted to run. We're tempted to hide. Evagrius of Pontus talks about the noontime devil. A monk wakes up in the morning, maybe it's 9 in the morning. He's not going to be eating until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So he wakes up in the morning, and normally what monks would do is they would weave baskets. And as they would weave baskets, they'd pray the Psalms. So it's 9 o'clock in the morning and he starts weaving his baskets. He's been out there a long time. It's not exciting anymore. And he starts thinking thoughts like this. I'm tired of being out here. There's nothing being accomplished in me out here. And then when I'm going to be eating at 3 in the afternoon are vegetables of some kind with a piece of bread, probably water, maybe lightly diluted wine. And it's 6 hours away. And now noon arrives. The sun is at its highest point in the sky. It's hot. And Evagrius says, the noontime devil arrives with a voice that sounds something like this. Well, look at you. A bored, tired, hungry monk, yes? It's hot. It's boring, isn't it? Don't you want to go home? Think of home. Think of Alexandria. Think of the leeks. Think of the wine. Think of the fine cakes. Nothing's being accomplished here, friend. Nothing. Let's join hands. I'll take you to a much better place. That's the voice of the noontime devil. And slowly, Evagrius says slowly, we move on to around 2 o'clock, and that very heated, difficult time passes. And for the wise and tested Ammas of the desert and Abbas of the desert, they know that voice. What the devil's saying is never, never the truth. And by following that voice, there would soon be bills to pay. So sometimes with this word sloth, what we're talking about is, again, things get so difficult, we're tempted to say, I just don't care anymore. So let's ponder together. Think of your life history. When have been the times when you have heard that voice of the noontime devil? When have you been tempted to run or give up on God when you simply could not make sense of something that had happened in your life? Life had simply become too difficult, your relationship with God too difficult, and you're tempted to say, or you were tempted to say, I just don't care anymore. That's what the desert dwellers mean by sloth. Let me tell you a story. It's about an Abba by the name of Abba Paul. Now, Abba Paul was a wise, holy, loving monk. And because he was wise, holy, liked to work with his hands, liked to work in planting and watering and growing plants, this can be done near certain areas of the desert, he now had his basic needs met. He had enough to eat, enough water to drink. His relationship with God seemed to be healthy. Noontime devil fairly quiet. And yet, he felt God was leading him simply to stay in the moment. So he'd get up every morning early, sun coming up. He'd be in his cell, and he'd start weaving his baskets. He's using his hands. He's weaving his baskets. And over the course of a year, you have a stack of baskets growing in his cave. He was acting as though he was suffering from sloth, even though he wasn't. And the other brothers watched him, and they wondered, why is he working so hard with his hands? That caught their attention, the manual labor he was engaged with. And then at the end of the year, there would be a stack of baskets. Now, in his particular case, he'd light a fire, take a year's work, and burn it up. he's back to ground zero in a manner of speaking. And the dust blows away into the wind. And he starts again. A new year, a new beginning. Working with his hands, manual labor, prayer, rest, tending the garden, year by year by year. And the result in his life was that the holiness being manifested always through love of some kind touched those around him. How might engaging in prayer and working with your hands bring life to you when those times of temptation come to run in a new direction? In what areas of your life with God is the Lord asking for perhaps greater stability? To be honest with you, I think that folks who make a hobby out of church shopping, I don't like this church, I'm sure it's better over here. I don't like this church I've been in for a while, I'm sure it's better over here. I think perhaps, trying to say this as kindly as possible, perhaps that person is suffering from the sloth that we've been talking about for a while in this session. Analyze with me the times when you've been tempted to run. Make a note for future pondering. The times when you've been tempted to run, the times when things have been simply too hard. How about taking a couple of years to think through and pray through the issue of stability? You can find out about stability. There's lots of desert material available to you. Perhaps that's the project the Lord has for you, to learn to be a more grounded, stable person who's not going to flee when things get difficult. Another word that we can take a look at is the word perseverance. Have there been times when the Lord's saying, walk with me, persevere with me, run this race well with me, we're going to get home together? How about the issue of perseverance? How great is the struggle to persevere? Again, the voice of the noontime devil would say this: oh, you're tired. You can't take another step. Nothing's being accomplished. Oh, lie down and take a long nap. Now, it's appropriate. I'm not saying it's appropriate not to get rest, but there are times when we'll be tempted to take that long nap simply because perseverance is too difficult. I see Abba Paul saying, dear child, don't give up. Hang in there with me. How about a question like this? When do you get spiritually discouraged, where in some way God is not meeting your expectations for how you think God should be acting, and you're tempted to give up? Can you remember times like that? Times when you get spiritually discouraged? I'll bet you probably were spiritually discouraged this past week. Surely this past month. Spiritual discouragement is not foreign to God's precious image bearers. It's more how we navigate that discouragement when it comes. How do I tend to act when I feel that God has let me down? How do I respond to other people when they disappoint me? Oftentimes, when image bearers get discouraged, when the noontime devil appears, they get distracted. Have there been times when you sense you've been distracted in your relationship with God because of the host of issues we've talked about here? You've gotten distracted. And so maybe a hobby has been a distraction. If you're going to act like this, I'm going to spend a lot of time doing this, or I'm just going to go from this to this to this. I really don't want to listen to you anymore. So the issue of distractions is an important one in the spiritual life. I have a friend, a well-known writer by the name of Richard Foster. He wrote a book called Celebration of Discipline. I know Richard feels that the most important issue for God's precious image bearers today is the issue of distraction. In fact, with the technology available to us, we could live a life of distraction all our lives. Just moving from one distraction to another distraction to another distraction, and never engaging in the wonderfully hard work of learning to love. Let me ask, what are the top 5 distractions for you? When you find yourself being distracted, what are the top 5 for you? When I was over in Europe, I had a close friend named Roger, and something terrible happened. He told me that his sister had been injured severely in a riding accident. She had fallen off a horse near where she lived in Oxford, England. And when I heard about this, I crossed the channel from France to England and visited her while she was still alive. Sadly, she'd been concussed very, very severely. She was in a coma. I whispered and talked to her by leaning over and just speaking in her ear. She never responded as far as I could tell. Sadly, I got home, and I think it was 3 or 4 months later when she died. Roger had heard this news, had come to church. That morning, I happened to be speaking, and it was as though he had been smacked in the face by God. Was there ever going to be a more difficult time for Roger to love God? And so after I spoke, he came up and he said, lividly, I'm so angry at God. Now, what I could have done at that point would have come up with 5 points why we shouldn't be angry with God when bad things happen, when the spiritual life gets really difficult, when we're disappointed, disillusioned with God, and so on. I knew that was not the way to respond to Roger. So this is what I said to Roger. You're going to have some time available now with all the arrangements and so on, and then there'll be a service, and then your life will begin to move on. When that time begins, when all the bustle and hustle of saying goodbye to your sister is parted, we do need to talk about these kinds of questions you've raised. They're very significant. Before we do, though, I want you to work out in your garden for at least 2 or 3 hours a day. What a strange thing to say. Rather than getting involved in a theology argument, I simply asked Roger to work with his hands in his garden for 2 to 3 hours a day. And he agreed. And finally, the time came for the conversation, which is going to remain private between me and Roger. But what was so clear is Roger could hear the words I had to say because he spent hours with his hands in the dirt in his garden. And to his credit, he didn't fall into sloth. He hung in there with God. He persevered. And in God's own mysterious way, God comforted him in the midst of his loss. How hard? How good? Well, we've had 10 sessions together. 10 sessions. We've talked about everything from anger to pride to envy, lust, sloth, a host of vices. And it's much more important to remember. I will be disappointed with you if you don't remember this. The heart of desert spirituality has to do with learning to love God and to love our neighbors. That is the heart of the matter. I'm trusting that you're hearing an invitation simply to ask with a prayer like this. Just a prayer as simple as this. Lord, I don't even know if you exist. I'm asking, Lord, do you exist? Perhaps, Lord, would you be gracious enough to give me a nudge of some kind that I can discern, and perhaps we begin a relationship together. There are others who are just starting out in their relationship with God, and much of what I've said might seem mysterious and strange, even hard to make sense out of. Fine, there's no rush. A prayer like this. Lord, I've been listening to Chris for hours now, and I might be a bit confused. Lord, I am a bit confused. Can you help me out? Maybe give me a nudge to know what I should focus on, maybe the one thing I should focus on for the next 5 years. And maybe there are some who've been listening who've known God for quite a while. And maybe there have been circumstances in their lives, disappointments in their lives, tragedies in their lives, where they've just put God on hold. They've switched off the light. All I'm asking, would you consider switching the light back on and seeing how God responds at that point? God is alive and well. The desert dwellers would teach us, even though there are challenges and concerns, sadnesses, partings, hopes, dreams that might never have been fulfilled for us. Hang in there. Maybe one of the Abbas that I mentioned along the way has appealed to you. Maybe it's Abba of Agrius. Maybe it's Abba Moses. Maybe it's Abba Paul. Maybe of all people it's that grizzly bear, Abba Arsenius. So I see all these Abbas with all their different personalities, gruff some, kind some, gentle some, all of them looking at you and saying, God loves you. We came to experience that love ourselves in the most unlikely environment, the desert. May the love of God rest upon you and keep you.